In a 2015 documentary interview, a former female Viet Cong fighter spoke words that shocked military historians. "We were not afraid of the American GIs, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing," she said quietly. "We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear." This wasn't propaganda. It wasn't bravado. It was fear spoken decades after the war ended by a woman who had survived what many of her comrades had not. Her testimony revealed something the official military records never fully captured. The alliance between American and Australian forces in Vietnam created a partnership that fundamentally changed how the war was fought in one crucial province. To understand why, you need to understand what brought these allies together, how they learned to fight as one, and what made their combined operations unlike anything the enemy had faced before. The story begins not in Vietnam, but on a humid afternoon in Canberra in May 1962, when United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk made a startling admission to Australian officials. "The U.S. Armed Forces know little about jungle warfare," he confessed during an ANZ-U.S. meeting. This acknowledgement would reshape America's approach to the Vietnam conflict and forge one of the most effective military partnerships of the war. The Americans possessed overwhelming firepower, technological superiority, and vast resources. What they lacked was the hard-won expertise in counterinsurgency warfare that Australian forces had developed over years of brutal jungle fighting in Malaya and Borneo. The Australian military had spent the previous decade perfecting the art of jungle warfare during the Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1958. They learned to move silently through dense vegetation, to think like guerrilla fighters, to set ambushes that turned the jungle itself into a weapon. They understood that defeating an insurgency required patience, stealth, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. When Indonesian confrontation erupted in Borneo from 1963 to 1966, Australian forces honed these skills even further, conducting secret cross-border operations that demanded absolute discretion and tactical precision. By the time Vietnam escalated into a major conflict, Australia possessed something invaluable: institutional knowledge about how to fight and win in the jungle against an elusive enemy who refused conventional engagement. When Australia first committed to Vietnam in July 1962, the deployment was modest. Colonel Francis Ted Sarong, one of Australia's foremost jungle warfare experts, led 30 highly qualified officers and NCOs to South Vietnam. They formed the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, known simply as the Team. Their mission was ostensibly non-combatant, focused on training South Vietnamese forces. Reality proved different. Within weeks, these advisors found themselves leading by example in combat situations, demonstrating tactics that diverged sharply from American doctrine. Sarong himself was a fascinating figure who embodied the Australian approach to jungle warfare. He had served in the Middle East and New Guinea during World War II, later commanded Australian forces in Korea, and had spent years analyzing counterinsurgency operations. His understanding of guerrilla warfare went beyond tactics into psychology and politics. He believed defeating insurgents required understanding their motivations, their support structures, their relationship with the civilian population. This holistic view contrasted with the American tendency to view the war primarily through a military lens, as a problem that could be solved through superior force and technology. The Australian advisors dispersed throughout South Vietnam, working with regional and provincial forces, often in remote areas far from American support. They lived alongside Vietnamese soldiers, ate the same food, endured the same conditions, learned the language and local customs. This immersion gave them insights that American advisors, rotating through on shorter tours and living on large bases, often lacked. The Australians learned which Vietnamese units were reliable, which commanders were competent, which areas were genuinely secure, and which were contested. They developed relationships that allowed them to function effectively in an alien environment. One of the most remarkable early operations involved Captain Barry Peterson, an ARTTV officer who worked with Montagnard tribespeople in the Central Highlands from 1963 to 1965. Peterson raised and trained a private army of Montagnard fighters, creating an effective counterinsurgency force in an area the South Vietnamese government had largely abandoned. His success highlighted both the potential and the problems of the advisory mission. On one hand, a skilled officer with cultural sensitivity and proper support could achieve remarkable results. On the other hand, South Vietnamese officials sometimes found sustained success by a foreigner difficult to accept. Peterson's operations were eventually shut down, partly due to South Vietnamese government jealousy and suspicion. The first Australian combat death in Vietnam came in July 1964, when Warrant Officer Class II Kevin Conway was killed during a sustained Viet Cong attack on Nam Dong Special Forces camp. Conway died fighting alongside American Special Forces Master Sergeant Gabriel Alamo, exemplifying from the beginning the partnership that would define the Allied effort. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam would ultimately become the most highly decorated Australian unit of the war, with 4 Victoria Crosses awarded, though these honors came at terrible cost. Of the 1,009 men who served with the team between 1962 and 1992, 33 were killed and over 120 wounded, casualty rates far higher than most other Australian units experienced. The Americans fought a war of overwhelming force, calling in artillery barrages, helicopter gunships, and air strikes whenever they made contact with the enemy. The Australians advocated for something more subtle, more patient, more deadly. This difference wasn't just philosophical. It reflected different geographies and resources. America possessed vast industrial capacity, seemingly unlimited ammunition, and could deploy air power and artillery on scales no other nation could match. Australian forces operated with smaller logistics tails, limited ammunition reserves, and had to make every round count. Necessity bred tactics that emphasized marksmanship, careful fire control, and using terrain rather than firepower for protection. Australian patrolling techniques became legendary among those who observed them. A typical Australian patrol might spend an hour preparing to leave base, checking equipment silently, applying camouflage, ensuring nothing rattled or reflected light. Once in the bush, they moved with excruciating slowness. The point man advanced perhaps 50 meters, then stopped and waited, watching and listening. The patrol closed up. Then the point man advanced again. Every few hundred meters, the entire patrol would halt and sit motionless for 20 to 30 minutes, simply observing their surroundings. This discipline allowed them to detect enemy presence before the enemy detected them, to hear the sounds of human activity before walking into an ambush, to identify trails and signs that faster-moving patrols would miss. Setting ambushes required even greater patience. An Australian patrol might identify a trail showing recent use, then establish an ambush position and wait for days. They would rotate watch silently, communicate with hand signals, eliminate all human noise and scent. They positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, placed claymore mines to channel enemy movement, prepared withdrawal routes in case they needed to break contact quickly. Then they waited. Sometimes the enemy appeared within hours. Sometimes it took days. Sometimes no one came, and the patrol withdrew after exhausting their supplies. But when the enemy did appear and walked into the kill zone, the results were devastating. The entire ambush might last 60 seconds from first shot to cease fire. Then the Australians would vanish, leaving only bodies and chaos. The differences in operational philosophy became starkly apparent when the first major Australian combat unit, the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, arrived in Vietnam in May 1965. They were initially attached to the U.S. 123rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa, operating just 25 kilometers from Saigon. The Australians watched American operations with growing concern. American units moved quickly, made noise, relied heavily on immediate fire support from artillery and air assets. When they contacted the enemy, the pattern was predictable. Engage briefly, call in massive firepower, then sweep through the area after the bombardment. Vietnamese Communist forces had adapted to this approach. They would ambush American patrols, inflict casualties in the opening minutes, then withdraw before the heavy weapons arrived. By the time American firepower transformed the jungle into a cratered moonscape, the enemy was kilometers away, already planning their next strike. Australian tactics operated on different principles entirely. They moved slowly, sometimes covering less than a kilometer in a full day of patrolling. They stopped frequently to watch and listen. They wrapped metal equipment in tape to eliminate noise. They mixed mud into their uniforms to kill shine. They didn't smoke on patrol, didn't cook hot meals, spoke only in whispers for days at a time. They laid ambushes and waited for hours or days for the enemy to walk into carefully prepared kill zones. Most importantly, they avoided major roads, obvious trails, and predictable routes that insurgents could monitor or booby-trap. This methodical approach frustrated some American commanders who wanted faster clearing of territory, but it produced results that could not be denied. The tactical differences weren't just about patience versus speed. They reflected fundamentally different understandings of how insurgencies function. American doctrine developed for conventional warfare in Europe emphasized seeking out and destroying enemy forces through superior firepower and mobility. Australian counterinsurgency doctrine, refined through years in Malaya and Borneo, emphasized denying the enemy access to the population, disrupting their supply lines, and making the operating environment so hostile that insurgent forces couldn't function effectively. The Americans sought to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible. The Australians sought to make the enemy's existence untenable. These philosophical differences created friction initially, but they also created opportunity. By mid-1965, it had become clear that South Vietnam couldn't survive without dramatically increased Allied support. The United States began a massive escalation, committing 200,000 troops by year's end. As part of this buildup, the U.S. government requested increased support from Allied nations. Australia responded by announcing in April 1966 that it would replace the single battalion at Bien Hoa with a full task force, a brigade-sized formation with integral armor, aviation, engineers, and artillery support. The first Australian task force would number 4,500 men initially, growing to over 8,000 at its peak. Crucially, Australian and American military leaders agreed that the Australian task force should operate in its own designated area of operations under Australian command. This decision, born from the operational tensions during 1RAR's attachment to American forces, would prove strategically brilliant. It allowed the Australians to fight their own tactical war, implementing counterinsurgency methods that differed from American practice. But it also created a laboratory where American and Australian forces would learn from each other, combining their respective strengths into something more effective than either could achieve alone. In April 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force established its base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, 50 miles east of Saigon. The province was a critical battleground. It contained major roads connecting Saigon to the coast, rubber plantations that provided cover for insurgent forces, and villages that served as recruiting grounds and supply sources for the Viet Cong. The local enemy forces were formidable. The Divaur 5 Provincial Mobile Battalion knew every trail and hiding place, while the 275th Regiment represented a main force unit capable of conventional military operations. Australian intelligence estimated that between 5,000 and 8,000 enemy soldiers operated in or around Phuoc Tuy. The selection of Nui Dat as the base location reflected Australian tactical thinking. Rather than creating a massive sanitized base like the enormous American installations at Bien Hoa or Long Bin, the Australians chose a site that would allow them to dominate the local area through constant patrolling. Nui Dat sat in the middle of Phuoc Tuy, positioned to interdict enemy movement between coastal areas and the interior. The base itself was relatively small and austere by American standards. Unlike American bases that often employed thousands of Vietnamese civilians as laborers, creating security nightmares, Nui Dat excluded all local nationals except in controlled circumstances. This made it harder for the enemy to gather intelligence about Australian troop strength, movements, and vulnerabilities. Establishing the base required enormous effort. The site was a rubber plantation, the trees providing some cover, but also limiting fields of fire and observation. Engineers cleared fields of fire around the perimeter, established defensive positions, built accommodations that ranged from tents to more permanent structures as time permitted. They constructed an airstrip for light aircraft and helicopters. Artillery positions were surveyed and prepared. Communication trenches connected key positions. The perimeter required constant vigilance because, unlike American bases surrounded by cleared fields and protected by massive firepower, Nui Dat existed within jungle that could conceal enemy approaches to within meters of the defenses. The first weeks at Nui Dat involved intensive patrolling to establish control over the immediate area. Australian units conducted clearing operations through the nearby villages of Long Tan and Long Phuoc, relocating civilians to create a secure perimeter. This population control, learned in Malaya, aimed to separate the insurgents from their support base. The operations were neither gentle nor universally popular. Forced relocation created resentment among Vietnamese civilians whose families had lived in these villages for generations. But from a military perspective, it allowed the Australians to create a defensive zone where any movement could be assumed hostile. The enemy response came swiftly. Viet Cong forces had operated in Phuoc Tuy for years and had no intention of surrendering the province without a fight. Small contacts occurred almost daily as Australian patrols encountered enemy scouts, supply parties, or small units. Booby traps and mines, a constant threat throughout Vietnam, appeared on trails around Nui Dat. One of the Australian Task Force's greatest tactical blunders occurred during this period when a 10-kilometer minefield was laid from Dat Do to the coast between 1966 and 1967. The intention was to create a barrier preventing enemy infiltration from coastal areas. Instead, Viet Cong fighters systematically dug up thousands of the so-called jumping jack mines and reused them against Australian patrols. This minefield ended up inflicting more casualties on Australian troops than it did on the enemy, a painful lesson about the complexities of warfare against an intelligent, adaptive opponent. The Australian Task Force at Nui Dat consisted initially of 2 infantry battalions, the 5th and 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. Supporting them were armor units with M113 armored personnel carriers, artillery equipped with 105mm pack howitzers, engineers, signals units, and reconnaissance assets. Critically, the task force included a squadron of Australia's elite Special Air Service Regiment, the unit that would become legendary among friend and foe alike. But the Australians didn't operate alone. Integrated into their task force were New Zealand artillery and infantry units, forming Anzac battalions. More significantly, the Americans assigned Battery A of the 2nd Battalion, 35th Field Artillery Regiment, to provide medium artillery support. Equipped with M109 155mm self-propelled guns, this battery became the only American unit during the entire Vietnam War to serve as a regular, integral component of a foreign combat force. The integration of Battery A illustrated the growing sophistication of Allied cooperation. Initially, Australian commanders expressed caution about the powerful American guns. The 155mm shells were more than 3 times as destructive as the Australian 100mm rounds, with a much larger fragmentation kill zone. The potential for error was correspondingly greater. For several months, the Australians used Battery A primarily against suspected enemy staging areas, base camps, and fortified positions, keeping the powerful guns away from close infantry support missions. But as the American gunners proved their accuracy and reliability, confidence grew. By late 1967, Battery A had become a tightly integrated part of the Australian Task Force, routinely providing fire support for all types of operations. This integration of American artillery with Australian ground forces created a combined arms capability that exceeded what either nation could field independently. The Australians brought infantry tactics, perfecting through years of counterinsurgency operations. The Americans brought heavy firepower and logistical capacity. Together, they created a force that could operate with the stealth and patience of counterinsurgency experts while possessing the striking power to destroy enemy formations when they were located and fixed. The combination proved devastatingly effective. The effectiveness of this partnership first became apparent at the Battle of Long Tan on August 18, 1966. The battle began when 108 men from D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, moved into a rubber plantation to locate Viet Cong positions that had mortared Nui Dat the previous night. Unbeknown to them, they were walking into contact with a force of over 2,000 enemy soldiers from the 275th Regiment and D 45 Battalion. What followed was one of the most desperate and critical battles in Australian military history, and a showcase for the power of Allied cooperation. As D Company found itself surrounded and heavily outnumbered, the response demonstrated everything that U.S.-Australian cooperation could achieve. New Zealand forward observer Captain Maurice Stanley, attached to D Company, began calling in artillery fire from the New Zealand Battery and the Australian Field Regiment at Nui Dat. The precision of this fire support was extraordinary. Despite torrential rain that reduced visibility to meters, artillery shells landed within 30 meters of Australian positions, sometimes closer. The enemy could gain no relief by hugging their adversaries, staying so close that supporting fires couldn't be used. The coordinated artillery bombardment inflicted devastating casualties on attacking formations. American forces played a crucial role as well. When requested, 3 U.S. Air Force F-4 Phantom jets responded immediately. Though heavy cloud prevented them from identifying targets on the ground, their willingness to support demonstrated Allied solidarity. More effective were 2 daring Royal Australian Air Force pilots from 9 Squadron who flew through atrocious weather at treetop height to drop ammunition resupply to D Company when their ammunition ran critically low. As darkness approached and the enemy massed for what might have been a final overwhelming assault, relief forces arrived. Australian infantry mounted in M113 armored personnel carriers, their 50 caliber machine guns blazing, broke through enemy positions to reach D Company. The battle lasted several hours. When it ended, 18 Australians were dead and 24 wounded. At least 200 Mach-5 enemy bodies were found on the battlefield, with many more casualties carried away during the night. Long 10 demonstrated the importance of combining and coordinating infantry, artillery, armor, and aviation. It showed that Australian infantry tactics, when supported by heavy and accurate firepower, could prevail against numerically superior forces. Most importantly, it established Australian dominance over Phuoc Tuy province. Although other large-scale battles would occur in subsequent years, the 1st Australian Task Force was never fundamentally challenged again in their primary area of operations. But the most profound example of U.S.-Australian cooperation, and the weapon that struck the deepest fear into enemy hearts, was the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. The SAS operated in 5-man patrols that inserted by helicopter deep into enemy territory and remained for weeks at a time. They moved with such stealth that they were virtually undetectable. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS squadrons conducted nearly 1,200 patrols throughout Phuoc Tuy and surrounding provinces. Their casualty figures were almost non-existent. 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing. Yet they eliminated over 600 confirmed enemy soldiers, achieving a kill ratio unprecedented in the entire war. The SAS selection and training produced soldiers unlike any others in Vietnam. Candidates underwent some of the most rigorous military training in the world. The selection course tested physical endurance, mental resilience, navigation skills, and the ability to function under extreme stress. Most candidates failed. Those who passed then underwent months of specialized training in reconnaissance, survival, weapons, demolitions, communications, and medical skills. Each trooper could navigate by stars and terrain features, could survive indefinitely in the jungle, could call in airstrikes and artillery fire, could treat serious wounds, could operate any weapon they might encounter. These were not just elite soldiers. They were trained to function independently for extended periods in hostile territory, making life and death decisions without higher authority, adapting to changing circumstances with minimal guidance. The 5-man patrol structure reflected hard-won lessons from operations in Malaya and Borneo. 5 men could move silently through jungle where larger groups inevitably made noise. 5 men could hide in positions where larger groups would be detected. 5 men created fewer logistical demands for resupply. Yet 5 men provided enough firepower and enough cross-trained skills to accomplish the mission and fight their way out if compromised. Each patrol typically included a patrol commander, a second-in-command who could take over if the commander was killed or wounded, a signaler who maintained communications with base, a scout who led movement and detected threats, and a medic who provided medical care but also functioned as a rifleman. Cross-training meant every man could perform every role if necessary. The insertion of SAS patrols by helicopter created the first point of cooperation with American aviation assets. While the Royal Australian Air Force provided some helicopter support, American helicopters, particularly from the 135th Assault Helicopter Company and other U.S. Army aviation units, frequently inserted and extracted SAS patrols. The coordination required was intricate. Planners selected insertion points that balanced several factors: close enough to the objective area to minimize patrol movement, far enough from enemy positions to avoid immediate contact, locations with terrain that allowed helicopter approaches and departures. Multiple insertion zones might be identified, with the actual insertion point selected at the last minute to confuse any enemy intelligence about patrol destinations. The insertion itself was a carefully choreographed evolution. Helicopters might conduct multiple flights in the area, landing at several locations, creating uncertainty about where patrols were actually deployed. Sometimes false insertions would occur, with helicopters landing but no one dismounting, purely to confuse enemy observers. When the patrol did dismount, it happened in seconds. The helicopter barely touched down. The 5 men sprinted off in different directions, and the aircraft climbed away immediately. The patrol then executed lying dog procedure, remaining absolutely motionless for up to an hour, watching and listening to determine if the insertion had been observed or if enemy forces were approaching. Only after this extended observation period would they begin moving toward their objective. Once inserted, SAS patrols existed in a different world from conventional forces. They moved perhaps 500 meters in an entire day, often less. Every movement was deliberate, every step carefully placed to avoid noise. They avoided trails entirely, moving through thick jungle where enemy patrols wouldn't travel. They communicated only by hand signals during daylight, whispered only when absolutely necessary at night. They ate cold rations that required no cooking. They urinated and defecated into bags that they carried rather than leaving any trace of their presence. They slept in shifts, always with at least 2 men awake and alert. This level of fieldcraft created an almost supernatural ability to remain undetected in areas where enemy forces operated regularly. The SAS worked closely with American Special Operations Forces, creating a cross-pollination of tactics and techniques that enhanced both forces. Australian SAS personnel taught at the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Reconnaissance Commando School at Nha Trang, starting in September 1966. The Recondo School trained American, South Vietnamese, and Allied reconnaissance personnel in long-range patrol techniques. Australian instructors brought their jungle warfare expertise, teaching stalking techniques, ambush tactics, silent movement, and the mental discipline required for extended operations in enemy territory. The American students, initially skeptical about what Australians could teach them, quickly became converts when they saw the results that SAS methods produced. They shared the infiltration tactics, silent movement techniques, and ambush methods they had perfected. American long-range reconnaissance patrol units adopted Australian methods, sometimes operating on joint patrols where American LRRPs learned directly from SAS mentors. These joint patrols created bonds between Australian and American Special Operations personnel that transcended national boundaries. Men who had patrolled together, who had depended on each other for survival in situations where a single mistake meant death, developed loyalty to their patrol mates that superseded everything else. Decades after the war, reunions of Vietnam-era Special Operations personnel regularly brought together Australian SAS and American LRRPs who had served together. Australian SAS soldiers served on exchange with American Special Forces, embedded in A-teams operating throughout Vietnam, and sometimes in classified cross-border operations. Some served with the highly classified Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, conducting reconnaissance and direct action missions in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. These operations, among the most dangerous of the war, demonstrated the complete trust American commanders placed in Australian Special Operations personnel. The fact that foreign nationals were allowed to participate in highly classified operations reflected both the desperation of the strategic situation and the proven competence of Australian SAS soldiers. The expertise flowed both ways. Australians learned American helicopter insertion techniques that were more sophisticated than those they had used previously. American aviation units had developed elaborate procedures for combat insertions, including covering fire from gunships, artillery preparation of landing zones, and extraction techniques that allowed patrols to be pulled out even under fire. Australian SAS patrols benefited from American advances in communications equipment. American tactical radios were lighter, more reliable, and more secure than earlier equipment. The Australians learned American procedures for calling in close air support, coordinating with forward air controllers, and integrating fixed-wing aircraft into ground operations. Most significantly, Australian Special Operations Forces gained access to American intelligence systems that they could never have developed independently. Signals intelligence from American aircraft and ground stations provided SAS patrols with information about enemy radio traffic and locations. Photo reconnaissance from American aircraft helped identify enemy base camps and supply routes. The massive American intelligence apparatus, with its satellites, electronic collection platforms, and networks of agents, could be focused to support Australian Special Operations in ways that dramatically enhanced their effectiveness. A 5-man Australian patrol, properly supported with American intelligence and fire support, could accomplish missions that would have required much larger forces operating without such support. The psychological impact of SAS operations extended far beyond the casualties they inflicted. Captured enemy documents from 1967 and 1968 specifically warned Viet Cong units about Australian SAS operations. These documents describe detailed tactics for dealing with American forces and techniques for ambushing regular Australian infantry. But for the SAS, the guidance was chilling in its simplicity. Avoid contact if possible. If contact is unavoidable, assume you are already under observation. Assume they know your positions and strength. Assume reinforcement has been called before the first shot is fired. This assumption reveals the psychological warfare the SAS waged without intending to. Every trail became suspect. Every jungle clearing could conceal watchers. Every supply movement risked walking into an ambush prepared days in advance. The integration of SAS operations with American aviation and fire support created a force multiplier effect. SAS patrols would locate enemy base camps, supply routes, or troop concentrations through patient observation. They would then call in American airstrikes or artillery bombardment to destroy the targets, or they would pass intelligence to larger Australian or American units for follow-up operations. This combination of elite reconnaissance with massive firepower available on demand created a system where the enemy could neither hide effectively nor move safely. The SASIs in the jungle, backed by American and Australian striking power, made large areas of Phuoc Toi effectively untenable for enemy operations. The Royal Australian Air Force's integration with American air operations demonstrated another dimension of Allied cooperation. Starting in April 1967, No. 2 Squadron REIF, equipped with Canberra bombers, flew strike missions from Phan Rang Air Base, 250 kilometers northeast of Saigon. The squadron came under command of the U.S. 35th Tactical Fighter Wing, operating fully integrated into American air operations. Australian bomber crews flew missions throughout South Vietnam, often in coordination with American forward air controllers and strike aircraft. From July 1966, Australian pilots served as airborne forward air controllers, flying U.S. Air Force aircraft, directing strike aircraft against enemy targets. 36 Australian FACs served between 1966 and 1971, becoming part of the complex air-ground coordination system that made American air power so effective. Naval cooperation added yet another layer to the alliance. Royal Australian Navy destroyers joined U.S. Navy patrols off the North Vietnamese coast, providing naval gunfire support for ground operations and interdicting coastal supply routes. The destroyer HMAS Hobart relieved the USS St. Paul in May 1970, providing naval gunfire support for Australian troops operating in the Long High Hills. RAN clearance diving teams worked alongside U.S. Navy personnel. Most significantly, in October 1967, the Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam began operations, integrated into the U.S. Army's 130th Assault Helicopter Company, flying UH-1 Iroquois helicopters in both utility and gunship configurations. Australian naval aviators provided tactical support for Australian and American ground forces, conducted medical evacuations, and flew search and rescue missions. The integration of Australian helicopters with American aviation units showcased the seamless nature of Allied cooperation by 1967. Australian pilots flew American aircraft, maintaining American standards and procedures while bringing their own tactical expertise. The joint missions involved elaborate coordination. The day before an operation, the Australian mission commander would attend briefings with American and Australian ground commanders. They would coordinate air movement of troops, gunship support, fuel requirements, artillery preparation, and extraction plans. On the day of the operation, command and control aircraft would launch early, proceeding to the battalion commander's field location to confirm final details. Artillery would prepare landing zones before the arrival of helicopters carrying assault troops. The entire complex ballet of modern combined arms warfare functioned because American and Australian forces had learned to operate as one integrated force. Intelligence cooperation formed the foundation that made tactical cooperation possible. In 1966, Australia deployed 547 Signal Troop to Nui Dat. This small unit, starting with just 15 personnel and growing to 35 by late 1967, worked as part of an integrated signals intelligence effort with American direct support units. The Australians collected and analyzed communications intelligence, producing tactical intelligence for the Australian Task Force commander while sharing information with American units. This integration of intelligence collection meant that enemy movements detected by Australian signals, intelligence could trigger American airstrikes, while intelligence gathered by American assets could direct Australian ground operations. The intelligence partnership extended to the strategic level. Pine Gap, the joint defense facility established in Central Australia in 1966, controlled U.S. satellites that collected signals intelligence from across Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. This intelligence flowed to both American and Australian forces in theater. The success of U.S.-Australian cooperation in Boak Toi Province stemmed from more than just compatible tactics and integrated operations. It reflected a deeper military-to-military relationship built on mutual respect, shared values, and compatible military cultures. Australian and American forces had fought together in World War I, most notably at the Battle of Hamel in 1918, when U.S. and Australian troops first fought side by side under Australian command. They had been genuine allies in World War II and had fought together in Korea. The institutional relationships, the shared language, the similar military traditions created a foundation for cooperation that could not easily be replicated with other allies. Yet the partnership also involved genuine tension and disagreement. Australian commanders sometimes found American operational methods wasteful and counterproductive. When Colonel Ted Sarong expressed doubt about the strategic Hamlet program at a U.S. counterinsurgency group meeting in Washington in May 1963, he drew what was described as a violent challenge from U.S. Marine General Victor Krulak. Australian emphasis on small unit tactics, careful patrolling, and population security clashed with American focus on large operations, high body counts, and destroying enemy main force units. American commanders sometimes criticized Australians for not clearing areas quickly enough, not being aggressive enough, not generating enough contact with the enemy. These tensions reflected different strategic approaches to the war. Americans believed they could win by inflicting enough casualties to break enemy will. Australians, drawing on their Malayan experience, believed success required separating the insurgents from the population, denying them supplies and recruits, and creating secure areas where government authority could be established. The American approach emphasized offense, mobility, and firepower. The Australian approach emphasized defense, patience, and population control. Neither approach succeeded strategically. The war was ultimately lost, not by military defeat, but by the collapse of political will in the United States and the inability of the South Vietnamese government to generate popular support. But at the tactical level in Boak Toi Province, the combination of American and Australian approaches created a model of counterinsurgency effectiveness. By 1969, Viet Cong activity in the province had collapsed. Australian operations had systematically disrupted enemy food supplies, making it impossible for main force units to pre-position supplies along intended routes of advance. Local guerrilla forces had to visit villages every few days to collect food, creating predictable patterns that allowed Australian forces to set hundreds of ambushes. The enemy-initiated contacts throughout Phuoc Toi dropped dramatically. The province never became fully pacified, and thousands of villagers probably still maintained political loyalty to the Viet Cong. But the military effectiveness of enemy forces had been broken. The Battle of Coral Balmoral in May and June 1968 provided another showcase for U.S.-Australian combined arms cooperation. Following the Tet Offensive, Australian forces deployed to fire support bases northeast of Saigon to block infiltration routes toward the capital. At fire support bases Coral and Balmoral, they faced regular North Vietnamese Army units operating in battalion and regimental strength, the largest and most sustained battle the Australians would fight in Vietnam. The Americans provided crucial support. Battery A of the U.S. 35th Field Artillery, fully integrated into Australian operations by this point, delivered devastating fire support. American helicopter units provided aerial reconnaissance, resupply, and medical evacuation. American air power struck enemy approach routes and staging areas. The battle demonstrated how far the integration had progressed. Australian and American artillery batteries fired coordinated barrages. Australian forward air controllers directed American strike aircraft. American helicopters delivered Australian reinforcements. The boundaries between Australian and American operations had become effectively invisible. Over 25 days of intense combat at Coral Balmoral, the Australians and their integrated American artillery suffered 25 killed and nearly 100 wounded. North Vietnamese losses exceeded 300 confirmed killed, with actual casualties likely far higher. The enemy forces withdrew, unable to maintain operations in the face of coordinated Allied firepower and aggressive Australian counterattacks supported by armor. The battle proved that Australian tactics, when supported by American resources and firepower, could defeat even main-force North Vietnamese units in near-conventional combat. The equipment integration between Australian and American forces illustrated the depth of cooperation. Australian forces used a mix of Australian, British, and American weapons. Their standard rifle was the 7.62mm L1A1 self-loading rifle, a British design, but they also used American M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, and M79 grenade launchers. Australian artillery used British 105mm pack howitzers alongside American 155mm M109 self-propelled guns. Australian armor operated M113 armored personnel carriers of American design, while their tank squadron used British Centurion tanks. This equipment mix required complex logistics, but it also allowed Australian forces to share ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance facilities with American units when operating together. The medical cooperation between Australian and American forces saved countless lives. The first Australian field hospital at Vung Tau, established in April 1968, treated American casualties as well as Australian. American medical evacuation helicopters routinely extracted Australian wounded. Australian and American medical personnel served together at field hospitals and surgical teams. The casualty evacuation system, where wounded soldiers could be in a field hospital within minutes and in a major surgical facility within an hour, represented one of the great medical achievements of the war. This system existed only because of seamless cooperation between Australian and American forces at every level. The impact of U.S.-Australian cooperation extended beyond tactical success in Phuoc Tuy Province. The partnership influenced American military thinking about counterinsurgency operations. Observing Australian methods led some American units to adopt similar tactics. American long-range reconnaissance patrol units modeled themselves partly on Australian SAS operations. American advisors working with Australian forces learned patience, stealth, and the importance of understanding local conditions. While these lessons took years to filter through American doctrine, they eventually influenced how the U.S. military approached subsequent counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. For Australia, the cooperation with American forces had strategic implications beyond Vietnam. The partnership deepened the ANZUS alliance, the security treaty between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, signed in 1951. Australian leaders believed their commitment to Vietnam and their willingness to fight effectively alongside American forces would strengthen U.S. commitment to Australian security. This calculation proved correct. The joint defense facilities established in Australia, including Pine Gap, represented American investment in Australian security. The intelligence sharing, military cooperation, and interoperability developed in Vietnam created lasting institutional relationships between Australian and American forces. The withdrawal of Australian forces from Vietnam began in November 1970 when the 8th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment completed its tour and was not replaced. The process accelerated through 1971 as the United States implemented Vietnamization, gradually transferring responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. By December 1972, Australia's combat involvement had ended, though advisors remained until the final American withdrawal in 1973. The first Australian task force left behind a complex legacy. They had achieved tactical success in Phuoc Tuy Province, dramatically reducing enemy activity and establishing security. But like their American allies, they could not achieve strategic victory. The war would end in 1975 with North Vietnamese tanks crashing through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. Over 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam between 1962 and 1973, with 523 dead and nearly 2,400 wounded. These losses occurred in a war that became deeply divisive in Australian society, just as it did in America. The anti-war movement, protests against conscription, and hostile receptions for returning soldiers paralleled the American experience. The trauma of Vietnam affected Australian military culture for decades, creating a generation of veterans who felt their service had been unappreciated and their sacrifices misunderstood. The political fallout contributed to the end of Australia's forward defence doctrine and a reorientation toward continental defence. Yet, the military cooperation between Australian and American forces in Vietnam established patterns that endure to this day. The two nations have fought together in every major conflict since: the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. The interoperability developed in Vietnam, where forces could operate seamlessly together despite different national command structures, became a model for coalition warfare. The intelligence sharing pioneered in Vietnam evolved into the Five Eyes Partnership, one of the world's most comprehensive intelligence sharing arrangements. The personal relationships forged between Australian and American soldiers, the shared experiences of combat, created lasting bonds between the two militaries. The secret weapon that terrified the Viet Cong was not technology or firepower, though both played roles. It was the combination of Australian tactical expertise in counterinsurgency warfare with American resources, firepower, and logistical capacity. Australian patience and stealth, honed through years in Malaya and Borneo, merged with American mobility and striking power to create a force that could find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with overwhelming force. The SAS exemplified this combination. Australian soldiers, moving with ghost-like stealth through the jungle, able to call on American helicopters for insertion and extraction, American artillery for fire support, American intelligence for targeting information. When that former Viet Cong fighter said she feared the Australian SAS because they made comrades disappear, she was describing the ultimate expression of U.S.-Australian cooperation. Those five-man patrols moving silently through the jungle were backed by the full weight of Allied military power. They could watch enemy movements for days, then call in airstrikes that obliterated the target. They could ambush a supply column, inflict devastating casualties, then vanish before reinforcements arrived, extracted by American helicopters. They represented something the enemy couldn't counter: elite soldiers who combined the best of Australian and American military capabilities into a force multiplier that exceeded the sum of its parts. The story of U.S.-Australian cooperation in Vietnam is not one of unalloyed success. Both nations fought bravely, sacrificed greatly, and ultimately failed to achieve their strategic objectives. The war ended in defeat, with South Vietnam conquered by the North and millions of Vietnamese dead or displaced. No amount of tactical proficiency could overcome the fundamental political problems that doomed the Allied effort. The South Vietnamese government never generated popular legitimacy. The enemy demonstrated infinite patience and willingness to absorb horrific casualties. American and Australian public support eventually collapsed under the weight of endless war and mounting casualties, but within the larger failure, the story of cooperation between American and Australian forces stands as an example of what Allied partnership can achieve. Two nations with different military cultures, different tactical doctrines, different strategic perspectives learned to work together seamlessly. They integrated their forces at every level, from strategic intelligence to tactical patrols. They shared not just equipment and logistics, but knowledge and expertise. American forces learned patience and stealth from Australian mentors. Australian forces gained access to American resources and firepower. The result was a combined force more capable than either nation could field independently. The female Viet Cong fighter who spoke of her fear decades after the war ended testified to the effectiveness of this partnership. She and her comrades weren't afraid of American firepower because they had learned to evade it. They weren't afraid of Australian infantry because they could anticipate their movements, but they feared the Australian SAS, those phantoms who moved through the jungle, backed by the full might of American military power. They feared the combination of stealth and striking power, of patience and overwhelming force, of elite soldiers who could call on unlimited resources. They feared what American and Australian forces achieved together, a level of military effectiveness that neither could achieve alone. This cooperation, forged in the rice paddies and jungles of Phuoc Toi Province, established patterns that endure. When Australian and American forces deploy together today in the Middle East or elsewhere, they do so building on foundations laid in Vietnam. The interoperability, the shared procedures, the mutual trust developed over years of fighting together remain part of both militaries' institutional memory. The price paid in blood to develop this cooperation was enormous. The strategic failure of the Vietnam War cast a long shadow over both nations, but the tactical success, the military effectiveness achieved through genuine Allied partnership offers lessons that remain relevant. In an era where coalition warfare has become the norm, where military operations routinely involve forces from multiple nations, the example of U.S.-Australian cooperation in Vietnam demonstrates what can be achieved when allies learn to fight not just alongside each other, but as a genuinely integrated force. That is the enduring legacy of their partnership, and perhaps the one positive lesson from a war that remains controversial and painful for both nations more than half a century after its end.